you both of you for being here. I was trying to take notes, but I think I got this right, Mr. Peterson, that you talked about this bill as being an expression of the vanguard of ideology. Am I right in thinking?
Well, I was thinking more about the policies that surrounded it, but okay. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm trying to square what you, as a party of one, are saying with published documents from the Canadian Psychological Association, the American Psychological Association, the Canadian Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the United Nations Human Rights experts. So these are all, these are not parties of one. They are associated. They are all, I imagine, lots of psychologists are members of the Canadian Psychology Association and the Canadian Psychiatry. So how are we to square what you're saying, which is your opinion, which you are absolutely entitled to, with what everyone is saying, plus the feelings and testimonies of the people who have suffered over 30 years, who've been taking issues to court? These are people who we've listened to. So how are we to square this?
Okay, well, with regards to your second point, if the people that you're listening to aren't randomly selected from a population, then their opinions are worthless from the perspective of testimony, because you don't know if you're dealing with a biased sample. And that's a big problem with the public consultation process that underlied this bill. And you can not appreciate that if you'd like, but it's standard practice in any polling institution or any body that's attempting to extract a genuine opinion out of a so-called community of people. And if that isn't followed, then you can't tell if the information that you're receiving is biased. And this, with regards to your first point, what exactly are all those people who aren't thinking the same way as me saying? You said that there's a bunch of them and a bunch of groups, but you never said what they're saying precisely.
Well, I think our chair would rule me out of order if I proceeded.
No, you're fine.
To read out what they're all saying. But in general, they say they oppose discrimination and harassment because of gender identity and gender expression. And then there's 3 pages, which I can share with you.
I oppose discrimination against gender identity and gender expression. That's not the point. The point is the specifics of the legislation that surrounds it and the insistence that people will have to use compelled speech. That's what I'm objecting to. I've dealt with all sorts of people in my life, people who don't fit in all sorts of different ways. I'm not a discriminatory person. There's 500 hours of my teaching to my classrooms on tape on YouTube, and nobody's found a smoking pistol. I'm not a discriminatory individual, but I think this legislation is reprehensible, and I do not believe for a moment that it will do what it intends to do. I also don't think that my opinion deviates substantially from the bodies that you're describing, because you haven't provided any evidence that they say anything other than discrimination is a bad thing. And I think that unreasonable discrimination is a bad thing. And it's unreasonable when people are judged for any reason other than the specific competence that they bring to, say, a given position. It's not in anyone's best interest that that occurs. But I don't think that you've demonstrated in the least that the opinions that I'm putting forward exist in opposition to the standard practices, say, of my particular discipline. So,
may I follow? Mm-hmm. Could you repeat one more time your response to Senators Gold and Pratt that the Ontario Human Rights Commission has provided what I would say reasonable alternatives to your objection to using pronouns?
Well, I think it's been made clear in the presentation so far is that it depends on which part of the Ontario Human Rights Commission's policies you read. And that's a big problem. I mean, one of the reasons I criticized this to begin with was because when I went through the policies, I could see that they're absolutely incoherent. So, for example, here, let me give you another example. So there's an insistence in the Ontario Human Rights Commission that sexual preference is an immutable phenomenon, which indicates, at least in principle, that it's biologically grounded. But by the same token, in exactly the same policies, they presume that sexual identity, and gender expression are entirely independent. It's like, sorry, guys, you can't have both of those because one's A and one's not A, and you can't put those together. And like, there's endless numbers of places in the policy surrounding Bill C-16 that are characterized by that kind of logical incoherency. And I mean, what's it going to do to people who are transgender, who are making the claim that they were, say, born that way at birth, which is a strong claim. That's a biological claim. It indicates that there's a direct causal connection between some biological phenomena and the expression of a particular identity. It's actually the strongest defense that people who have, let's call them non-standard sexual identities or gender identities, have to defend their claims.
So I have to wrap it up there and move on to Senator Boisvert.
When we're talking about whether you can force someone to refer to you or refrain from referring to you in different ways, I guess one issue that I'm having difficulty with is what a pronoun is. I think we'd all acknowledge that you have a right to force people to refer to you in certain ways. If a professor had a class and they had a student who insisted on calling them a girl when they were male, or calling them queer or something, or I can think of way worse words, they would say, well, that's not a pronoun, that's a derogatory label that's just meant to degrade me. But if who's to say what is a pronoun? And I'm not sure that it necessarily would change if 95 or 97 friends all insisted on sort of degrading or using that pejorative label to the person. And I think that people who are transgendered or whatever do experience when people use the wrong gender labels to them. They've experienced real prejudice. They experience it as kind of oppressive in that way. So I don't know if identity is a subject or an object. But I do know that we place important demands on one another. I don't know about nature, but I know that fundamentally, like, our society is going to work better if we respect each other, and I think history bears that out. That self-respect and allowing people's self-identification to play a role in that public aspect. We do already have limits on how people can refer to each other, and they're informed by how people want themselves to be referred to.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of questions. So, and that's, I'm not trying to be a smart aleck about that. It's just, I'm going to have to sort that out for a minute. Well, the first thing I would say is, pronouns, and I'm not a linguist, so I'm not going to be able to whip this off the top of my head, although I do know that there is a psychologist named James Pennebaker who's written a whole book on pronouns, which you might be interested in referring to, and pronouns turn out to be extraordinarily important as signifiers, but they're also part of what's called a closed linguistic category, and they don't change. And so that's something that's useful to know. But you also bring up the distinction, or the lack of distinction, or made a lack of distinction between adjectives and pronouns, and that's pretty interesting, because there's no real reason why, if you can't insist upon which pronoun I use to address you, you can't also insist on which adjective I use to address you. And there's a lot more adjectives. And so that's, because I don't see, like, if you can choose your damn pronoun, why can't you choose your adjective? I mean, adjectives are, the words you listed as pejorative were actually not pronouns, they were adjectives. And so you can object to them. And there's no shortage